All right, welcome everyone to the Art of the Second Thought. We have our lovely teacher, Katarina Turner, here today. And this is a topic that was inspired kind of through other classes and what was shared, at the end of other classes within the community. Um, and working and addressing impulsivity is a really helpful thing for all of us and something that can be um, kind of a challenge post-brain injury. So I'm really thankful that she is here today. She has extensive experience working with brain injury community. She's done a lot of case management, has worked and is working with veterans and has a family member with a brain injury. So definitely comes with a lot of different layers of experience and a very compassionate heart. So, Katerina, thank you for being here. I am here to support and learn along with all of you. So, thank you. Your turn.
Hello, all. Thank you again, Reggie, for your lovely and kind words. I'm Katarina, and I'm so glad you're all here. Whether you're here as a survivor, a partner, or both, I did kind of develop this class with everyone in mind. As Reggie mentioned, I'm an educator rather than a survivor, so what I bring to this conversation is the best of what research and the survivor community have worked out together about how different versions of impulsivity may show up after brain injury. And the space between, what happens and what we do about it is what we'll call the second thought. So over our time together, we'll look at where that space lives in the brain, why a brain injury makes it harder to find, and what people have found useful. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. I thought this quote was fitting for what we're reviewing today. The space it describes, the small interval between something happening and what we do about it, is what the class is primarily going to be about. We're going to look at where that space lives in the brain, why a brain injury can shorten it, and what people have found useful when it feels shorter than it used to. Changes in impulse control are among the most widely reported effects of moderate to severe brain injury, and they tend to be the changes that families and survivors mention first when describing what's different. In one large study, about a third of survivors at that level of injury showed behavioral changes serious enough to disrupt daily life. And the two patterns that showed up the most often were irritability and disinhibition, which primarily just means a shorter fuse and the loss of the brain's usual brake on words and actions. The exact numbers shift from study to study. I didn't think that that was very important today, depending on what researchers measure and how they measure it. But the pattern itself has held steady across all studies. So this is a common feature of life after moderate to severe brain injury and is one of the most studied effects in the field. So how does it show up in your daily life? Impulsivity after brain injury is not a single thing. And I know it's really difficult when you're attending brain injury classes or maybe you're reading literature on, the impact of brain injury. And that's typically what's said the most often is there's no brain injury that's the same. So how it often shows up is a family of related patterns and recognizing which member of the family is showing up in your life is much of the work. So before walking through the six on this slide, something to keep in your mind as you listen: how impulsivity presents, whether it shows up at all, which form it takes, how often, how intensely it will vary from person to person, and the severity of injury, the mechanism, the specific regions affected. If you had prior brain injuries, other conditions a person, may have been living with before, or medication, those all matter and they all impact and they look differently. So, two people with what looks like the same injury on paper can have very different experiences of this. And what follows may apply in part, in full, or maybe not at all. So, the first one we're going to look at is speaking. And speaking is often the first thing that survivors and people around them notice. And it can look like word for word, oral thought to mouth, kind of with no in between, um, rather than a usual interval of someone maybe taking a breath or a beat before they say something. It may look like swearing in a setting where maybe it's not appropriate, or even swearing when maybe you weren't a person who swore often before. Another is interrupting without realizing it, or if you're in the midst of a conversation and someone's speaking and you're having a really hard time focusing on what they're saying because you have something that you want to say and you want to get it out as soon as possible. So then it kind of just blurts out if it's, relevant or not. So some of these things from the outside can appear to be a personality change. Inside the brain, the filter more often fails to run quickly enough to catch what's already on its way out. The second is feelings, and that can be the emotional version of kind of the same circuit. So, what that would look like is your emotions arriving at a volume of a situation that it didn't seem to call for. So, perhaps being tearful in a moment that maybe, again, is not appropriate at that time, or anger that moves from quiet to full intensity without that gradient in the middle. Um, and families often describe this as one of the more consistent changes that they do notice in months or years after the injury. And spending. Spending shows up as decisions made faster than they used to be. So, what that would look like is maybe the Amazon cart that gets checked out before there's time to weigh whether the purchase is appropriate, or if maybe you're taking from rent money at that time, but in that moment it was something that you needed, and you ended up checking out without really weighing the consequences. And these rarely come from wanting the thing themselves. They come from the second thought not arriving in time. And the same pattern can also cluster with behaviors next to it, which may look like overeating, over drinking, gambling. And that's not to say that this is a one size fits all, but sometimes these can be comorbid behaviors that are coupled with spending. Eating. Eating can look different at different ages, especially in children and teens after a brain injury. Sometimes it can show up as food hoarding, squirreling things away, eating in secret, or an outsized response to food being around. And in adult survivors, it can look more so like grazing throughout the day, eating past the point of fullness, or finishing what's in front of you without you even registering what you ate. Or if you look down and maybe you'll say, like, oh, so and so husband, like, did you finish my last bite? But you weren't really paying attention to, savoring the food or enjoying the food. It just kind of all went. And then deciding is the close cousin of speaking, and it can operate on the same timeline. So a yes given before the implication had been thought through, a no offered before a question has landed, or if you're making perhaps commitments made on a phone call that day that you didn't really think through or consider. And this is loss of premeditation, which is the ability to stop oneself before answering. And then moving. Moving can be the body's version of the same circuit as well. So on the lighter end of the spectrum, it may show up as standing up partway through a conversation, or leaving a room when you meant to stay, or even walking out of a store before you had planned to. And again, these are just examples, and it may show up differently, not at all, or some variation of this. So the space that lives just behind the forehead in a region called the prefrontal cortex in evolutionary terms, is the youngest part of the brain, and it's the last region to finish developing in a lifetime. The wiring continues to mature into the mid-20s. So somewhere around the age of 25 for most people, through the exact timing varies. But that circuit does the work, and that's what holds a person back from doing the first thing that occurs to them, the planning, weighing consequences, and holding a response long enough to choose a better one. And that's where the pause is, the prefrontal cortex doing its job. And the brain's geography creates a vulnerability here. The prefrontal cortex, especially a region tucked underneath it called the orbitofrontal cortex, sits against the inside of the skull. So, depending again, like I mentioned, on your mechanism of injury, whether it was a fall, a crash, a blast, a sports impact, when that brain gets moved inside the skull and slides forward, the front of the brain is the part that gets damaged first, and that's where the pausing happens. So, the injury often extends past the prefrontal cortex itself into the wiring that runs from there down deeper into structures and involved in that impulse control. So that circuit shows measurable damage across studies of thousands of survivors. And this is wiring injury in a specific region of the brain. And reading it as a character motivation or problem steers the response in a very unhelpful direction. So the effort is absolutely still there. It's just the part of the brain that turns the effort into the pause was injured. So two small words here, won't and can't. I'm very big on verbiage and kind of the implicit meanings of the verbiage and the weight that it carries. So the word won't carries an assumption that the person could and is choosing not to, which we all know is not very true. It shows up in the way families sometimes describe what they're seeing and in the way survivors maybe sometimes describe themselves. So when the behavior is read as won't, the response tends to shift towards frustration, correction, or maybe making it about willpower and shame. And Redis can't yet, the response moves elsewhere. So, given what the prefrontal cortex does and how it gets injured, can't yet is the more accurate description. The pause circuit's still healing and the path forward looks different from what it used to. So just in the simple manner of reframing with verbiage removes the responsibility of what we say and do still has impact, and the impact still belongs to you. And the reframe is more so about directing the work toward what's happening in the brain. When a part of the brain has been injured, recovery moves forward through support around the injury rather than, putting the pressure across it. So asking yourself to pause through sheer effort while the part of the brain that does the pausing is still healing. And it could be years. Your injury could have happened 20 years ago. You're still healing, you're still developing the neuroplasticity. So asking something the injury has not returned to yet, it's just not fair. So what helps is support around the function itself, making adjustments to the environment, resets in the body, language prepared in advance for moments that arrive faster than the thought, and the people in your life who can hold steady alongside you. The phrase can't yet reiterates that the brain is still in repair, behaves differently from a brain that is not. The model on the slide is called the window of tolerance, and it offers a way to understand why the same person can handle perhaps a difficult moment one day, and then the next day you're completely in shambles. So picture a range, and inside that range, you're kind of at your baseline. You feel like yourself, not necessarily calm, not necessarily happy, but steady enough to think before you say something or act and to use the kinds of tools that we're going to get into here next. So, inside this range, the prefrontal cortex has the most influence over what happens next, and the pause is available at that time. Above the range, the body is in a revved up state. Your heart is faster, your words are quicker, everything is pulling towards a reaction. And then below the range is the opposite direction. So foggy, numb, shut down. And in both states, the prefrontal cortex is still there, but faster parts of the brain have taken over in that moment, and the pause becomes much harder to find. So, the tools we're about to dive into, we're going to do a deep, they really depend on the prefrontal cortex being the most influential. And when it's not, I can teach you all the breathing exercises or sentences to say, but when your prefrontal cortex is not being the most influential, nothing's going to work in that time. So the work then is less about pushing through the difficult moments and more so about noticing when you've started to leave that range and knowing what brings you back. So HALT comes from the recovery word that has been long adopted across medicine. It's just four letters, stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired. When any of those four are true, the brain has fewer resources for the pause, and then that window becomes smaller. For brain injury, four letters don't quite cover it. It's great. I love HALT. But today we're going to add a few more. So P is for pain, chronic pain, which many survivors live with. It definitely narrows the window on its own. O is for overstimulated. Someone speaking loud, noise, light crowds, grocery store at 5 o'clock, a dog barking, you name it. S is for sleep deprived, which is very different from being tired. Sleep is when the brain consolidates and repairs, and any disrupted sleep after injury may happen more often. So, halt, pause. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired, in pain, overstimulated, or sleep deprived. Most of the impulse moments survivors and families describe have two or three of these stacked behind them. The window had already shrunk before the moment arrived. So this is something to think about when perhaps you're making a decision. Do I really want to spend this money maybe I'm putting towards rent to have that feel good, moment, or perhaps do I just need a snack? Am I hungry? Am I sleep deprived? So just having that self-assessment. So picture a painter's palette as the mental and emotional resources a person has to spend in a day. Paying attention costs something. So does holding back a reaction and handling a difficult conversation, making a decision, or, you know, sitting through something difficult. When those resources run low, everything takes more effort. Even I'm sure sitting here staring at a screen and listening to me, trying to get through all of this information is taking a lot of effort. Pre-injury, maybe an ordinary day, a difficult phone call, dinner, normal tasks. You may have been tired, but functional. And the reserve now is a little bit smaller, so it drains faster. The same day uses more energy to get through, and the parts of the day that require the finest kind of effort, which is restraint, the second thought, holding back a response, are the parts that go first. So this is what survivors are describing when, they talk about hitting a wall or having nothing left. The mental effort it takes to hold back a reaction or a thought or again a movement is among one of the most expensive thing that the brain does, which is why that capacity is so often the first to thin. So really paying attention to how full the reserve is on any given day, noticing what tends to drain it faster, and then finding ways to protect what remains when something has already happened that you would rather not repeat. So I just wanted to take a little bit of off ramp here into shame, just because it's so important to address. Sometimes, after a hard moment, most people instinctively turn on themselves. And that instinct, while understandable, is the one that makes the next hard moment more likely. Self-criticism uses up the same mental and emotional energy that would otherwise go toward doing things differently next time. So self-compassion does the opposite. It can protect your energy and keep it available for the moments that's still ahead. And there's a real body of research on it, including studies specific to brain injury survivors, but people who learn to treat themselves with the same patience that you would extend to perhaps a loved one or a friend tend to recover their footing faster after a difficult moment, and get stuck less in self-criticism. And then you have that more room and more capacity to really focus on what you'd like to do next time. So what this would look like in practice is treating yourself the way you would treat a friend who came to you in that same moment. Acknowledge what happened. Notice that it's not the whole story of who you are, and then turn toward what comes next. And there are four questions on the slide, and they're for noticing and not for answering. There's no right or wrong answer to them. And the value is in the noticing itself. So the first question is where does my paint dry the fastest? For some people, that's the conversation. For others, it's making a decision. What am I eating for dinner tonight? Which for me, neurotypical is one of the biggest struggles that I have is what am I going to make for dinner tonight? So even it could be small decisions. What am I going to wear today? When am I going to make that phone call or that appointment that I need to schedule? The point is to notice where in an ordinary day the resources start to thin out because that's the territory that you really want to protect. And the second question is which halt pause amplifier narrows your window the most? Some people are affected most by overstimulation. Some really struggle with daily pain. And maybe there's a combination of all of them or poor sleep and exhaustion. So knowing which one hits hardest changes how you can move forward and how you can again do those self-assessments. The third is when in the day the reserve is the lowest. When the day is mapped out, most people find a predictable window. That could look like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sorry, it's 2 o'clock your time. You're attending this class. That's typically when a lot of people go through that lull. Or before you've eaten. So that window is useful information and it points to when not to schedule a difficult conversation or maybe um, high taxing events of your weekly schedule. And the fourth question is whose presence helps you find your footing when you have lost it? The person whose voice on the phone lowers the temperature or who just by being in the room makes it easier to think. And that name belongs in your toolkit as much as any of the techniques that we're going to talk about. So these four questions are not just kind of a one-time exercise, but rather an ongoing observation and a self-assessment check-in. So here are four kinds of different tools that you can keep on hand. External supports like a planner, an alarm, a written list, a code word with a partner. This was something that came up in a previous class, which I loved. So, whatever works for you in that moment. The toolkit is divided into four kinds and each suited to a different kind of moment. The first kind uses the body. There are physical resets, breathing techniques, which can be learned in other classes through Brain Northwest, cold water on the face, a brief walk. The second kind uses an environment. So making changes to the room around you, earplugs and noisy settings, written schedule. These are tools for prevention, and they tend to be the most useful for the patterns already known about the day. The hour when the paint really starts to run thin, the situation, begins to narrow that window. And that kind of overstimulation has definitely caught people off guard. So just knowing again where your threshold is for your lulls in your day. And then another kind is co-regulation. So sitting near someone whose calm nervous system studies yours. And again, that code word agreed with a partner, a friend you can text in the middle of something hard, um, a pre-written script just to help get through those tough situations is always very useful. And here are some different brushes for the body. The first is a physiological sigh. And this is something I notice myself doing all the time when I'm feeling pretty stressed out. And again, here's life. I apologize if you hear my doorbell. The first is, two short inhales through the nose, followed by one long exhale through the mouth. Compared in research against other breathing patterns and against mindfulness meditation, this one produced the largest measurable reduction in physiological arousal and the largest improvements in mood after a month of daily practice. It's also invisible. So right here, as my dog's barking upstairs and my doorbell is ringing, I'm quietly doing some deep breaths to regulate myself. So this is something that you can do on your own. And the second is a splash of water on the cold face. Intense emotion easily noticeable, within that window because the cold against the face signals the body to slow the heart rate and pull the nervous system towards calm. One important caveat with that is, before anyone tries this, if you have a history of heart problems, a slow resting heart rate, or perhaps an eating disorder, skip this tool and always speak about that with your physician. The third is sensory grounding, which works on a different principle than the first two. So rather than changing what's happening in your body, it changes what the mind is paying attention to. So naming 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste. And it works because our attention's finite. If you're focusing on the texture of your sleeve, you're not really focusing on the spiral or whatever was building a moment ago. And the fourth is the 60 seconds of movement. Movement here means anything that engages the body in a way it wasn't engaged a moment ago. So that could look differently for everyone, whether that's a short walk, stretching from a seated position, having your arms overhead, doing shoulder rolls, opening and closing of the fist. What they all share is they discharge the activation in the body and allowing the slower, more reflective part of the brain to kind of come back to the forefront. And it's one of the most accessible resets because something is always available for you to do. So we kind of touched on this a little bit ago about changing the studio per se before you change the work. Every change you make to the environment around you is a pause your brain no longer has to make on its own. So there are the 3 moves that tend to make the biggest difference. And the first is reducing the inputs that drain the resources fastest. So noise, glare, crowded spaces, keeping earplugs on hand, um, building routines throughout the day, eating at consistent times, written schedules and visible reminders. And then the third is letting your devices do the work for you. If you have a smartphone or, a phone alarm for a transition between activities, just so you know, some individuals do struggle with that transitioning time. So setting an alarm of, okay, I know that I'm going to have to go to this appointment. So at 12 o'clock, I need to set my alarm so I can begin to get prepared. And there are 6 small practices on the slide for holding the space as it narrows, like we mentioned earlier, when you feel like your threshold is narrowing. So picking one and using it regularly tends to do more than trying to learn all 6 at once. So you feel free to try them out. If one sticks, great. If not, that's completely okay. The first is called stop. The 4 letters stand for stop. So take a step back, observe, and proceed mindfully. And it sounds simple, um, which is what makes it effective. So the practice is to say the word stop to yourself when you feel a reaction rising. Take a literal pause before you do anything. Notice what's happening in your body and in the situation, and then choose what to do. So you're kind of, our bodies are naturally in autopilot with our prefrontal cortex. So kind of going in manual mode and literally saying stop. What am I doing here? So creating that natural pause for yourself. Urge surfing comes from relapse prevention research, and it's images of waves. So an urge to say the thing or to make the purchase or to leave the room does not stay at full intensity. You'll feel it rise, it peaks within 20 to 30 minutes, and then it falls on its own. So the work is not to fight the urge, the work is to outlast it. The 24-hour rule applies to any bigger decision than what is for lunch. Whether that's answering an email, completing an online purchase, saying yes to plans, the practice is a single sentence held in reserve for these moments. Um, but I want to give you a real answer. Can I get back to you tomorrow? A day in most cases is enough. So just postponing, hey, can I get back to you on this? Can we talk about this at a later time? I'm not really in the right headspace, and just let it sit for 24 hours. And then if then plans are preloaded with decisions, and the format's pretty straightforward. So if this happens, then I will do that. And the version for impulsivity may sound like, if I feel my chest tighten when she brings up money, I'll say, let me think about that and I'll call you back. The plan has already been decided, so the prefrontal cortex doesn't have to find one in the moment. The HALT check is a quick scan before responding to anything difficult. So again, running through, am I tired? Am I hungry? Am I in pain? Am I overstimulated? Um, Hold the response until at least one of them has been addressed. And the simplest of the six is just to wait. Easier said than done, Katerina, I know. But 3 breaths before answering, about 6 seconds. Um, Often the difference between the sentence that you said and the sentence you wish you said is often within that window. So just giving it about 6 seconds. And a few of the practices that work in this category are having an accountability partner and someone who knows what you're working on and who you can text in the middle of something hard, not to be talked out of it, but simply to have another person and their nervous system in the room with you to really kind of gauge the temperature in the room and sense when it's climbing. You can use perhaps the color yellow. Say you're in this training right now and you could just say, oh, yellow. Someone could take over and log out for you, and that is completely fine. Just having that code word, that co-regulation, that private word to where you're done. No explanation needs to be had. You don't have to take any more energy out that requires to even have that conversation. You can use a pet's name. And what matters is the word is small enough to say easily and clear enough that no one has to explain what it means. A family signal does the same job without words, and a hand on the table, maybe 2 taps on the arm of a chair, whatever the household had agreed on. And sometimes the practice is the simplest one of all, and that's just someone who will sit close and let your nervous system find theirs without giving any advice or without trying to fix anything. And that's the most regulating thing, is not always advice. Sometimes it's just the company. And moments of friction are going to happen, which is why the last piece of this class is about what to do after. Research on couples and other close adult relationships have landed on something most people find counterintuitive when they first hear it, and that's healthy relationships are not rupture free. They're repair rich. And what that means is, when the pause circuit is not what it used to be and ruptures happen more often, the useful question is not, how do I not explode anymore? How do I never rupture again? It's a great question. A lot of people would like to know, but um, the useful question is, how do I get good at repair? And there are 4 steps on the slide that you can take with you again or leave. And the first is to acknowledge. So not, I'm sorry, but, or not, I'm sorry if you felt. Really just name what happened. Say, I see what happened. That came out harder than I meant it, and just own it. Take responsibility. That wasn't okay. That was not what I wanted to say either. And then move on. When you make those long apologies, it tends to become more so about the apologer's distress, which pulls the other person into comforting you, and it's not repair. The third is to reconnect, which is the step that's most often skipped, which is the are you okay? What do you need right now? Or if you need space yourself, can I take a walk and come back in 20 minutes? Reconnection is not always immediate, and sometimes it's a promise. I'll be back and we'll be okay. If you just need to take a moment and just having that, I'll be back. We're okay. We'll talk about it later. And then the fourth is to reflect. Definitely not in the heat of the moment, but in a cooler hour when, again, there's paint on the palette and you can look back at what was going on and which of the halt pause letters were true. What might be worth trying differently next time. And then for partners, the same 4 steps belong to you as well. So you're going to have moments of rupture too. Caregiving is hard, and the people doing it are not exempt from being human. So really implementing the halt pause for yourself is also very important. So we've covered a great deal where the pause lives, why a brain injury makes it harder to find, what shrinks the window of tolerance, and what shows up when it has, and a set of tools for the body, the environment, the mind, and the people in your life. So again, please feel free to carry whatever fits and leave the rest. If something on a slide does not match your life, set it aside without a second thought. And if you have strategies of your own that perhaps we didn't cover today, one that maybe you've already been working on for someone you love or yourself, I would love to hear about it. The survivor community knows a great deal that research has not yet caught up with, and the class always learns from the room. So here too is a small shelf of further reading. These slides will be disseminated by Reggie, so you don't have to take a picture or write any of this down. This will all be sent your way with the links included. So some helpful reads here. And my favorite, I have to say, is Atomic Habits. So if you're a reader, if you're up to it, that's a really great book. So thank you all. That is all that I have for you today. I do hope that I see you again in future classes. And we're going to stop here, stop sharing, and stop recording so you guys can ask any questions that you have or any comments that you'd like to share.